Okay, so thank you so much, Karyn, for joining us and for participating in this introduction of your beautiful film, The
Oh,
Invitation.
thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm glad you're screening it. So thanks.
Yes. Um, so I wanted to ask you, how important is it to you that people are surprised, and what do you perceive as the film's use of suspense, red herrings, and plot twists?
When I first started making the film, I thought of it more as a psychological thriller or a very, very disturbing family drama. And so I never really considered that the suspense would be such an important part of the experience of the film. But in fact, I think as I was making it and as I was cutting it, it became really clear that it was important to keep a lot of questions alive, which is what I think suspense really is a sense of not knowing what's coming around the corner, as opposed to thinking you do know. So it was all about a process of subverting expectations and perhaps playing with ideas that people felt they were already familiar with.
And in a nutshell, how do you describe just the synopsis of The Invitation to people who have never seen it?
How do I describe the invitation? I probably would say that it's about a man who goes to the home he used to share with his now ex-wife to be reunited with her and her new husband and an old group of friends. And he is bringing his new girlfriend to this dinner party. And it's socially awkward at best and terrifying at worst.
How did you go about casting this absolutely incredible ensemble?
Mm, thank you. The casting process was interesting because it was such a low budget film. We sort of had to be upfront with everybody about our circumstances, and so what ended up happening was we ended up finding all these actors who really just wanted to be there, wanted to play those parts. It's really like very clear that they weren't there to make money. They were there to work together in what was almost like this like theater troupe environment while we were making the film. It all started with Logan Marshall Green, who was the anchor and anchor to the cast and the protagonist of the film. And then from there, I felt like a lot of people fell into place pretty quickly. Um, and it did end up being such a wonderful group of people.
Yeah, I was just kind of doing a little bit of research into the various cast members and the pedigrees of these
Mm,
actors. I mean, it's Tammy Blanchard, I believe, has been nominated or perhaps even won Tonys,
yeah.
and I
Oh,
just
yeah.
I have to bring her up because how did you guys create this character of Eden? She's so well
Mm,
realized. She's
mm,
traumatized. She's threatening. She's scary. She's vulnerable. She's all these things. Like, were there real life examples that she was drawing from or other
mm.
fictional characters? I'm just curious, like, and how collaborative was the creation of that character?
Yeah, I mean, I think Eden in particular is a very difficult character because, on the one hand, in the world and in the experience of the film, she might be considered an antagonist, and yet she's also incredibly fragile and emotionally very, very stricken and very unstable. And so it was important that we find an actor who could play those layers and make them feel real and make the transitions between all of those states feel real and familiar and um I don't want to say really so much sympathetic as relatable, you know. And I do think that she was a particularly gifted member of the cast. She has such a kind of an openness toward really finding the edge of a performance.
Yeah, it is. It is a remarkable performance, and credit also to the screenplay and to your direction of
Mm,
that pivotal flashback scene where they're in the tub
mm, mm,
and you see what they were like prior to the tragedy that occurred with their
yeah.
son. And that moment is just, it's so mind blowing because it's like a different character altogether.
Yeah.
she's gone through this transformation that has just powerfully changed her for the worse.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. We had this opportunity in the script to see the characters in the present day and experience them in the present day, but then we also get these flashes of what their life was like before when it was freer and easier and more joyous. And I hope that the cumulative effect of those flashbacks is to hook into the sadness of their day-to-day lives at this point.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to ask you about is, David and Eden. It seems like they were changed by the tragedy that they experienced. Of course, we haven't seen any flashbacks with David, but Sadie and Pruitt seem like they were possibly disturbed, like prior to their experience with grief, or that there's something else going on there. So I was going to ask you this later when I wanted to kind of cover the cult topic, but
Mm-hmm.
how do you think about the members of the Invitation cult and like the different motivations for joining it? And to kind of like clarify that question, I'm just curious, like, was that a challenge to kind of like have these four different characters representing like perhaps different motivations for being in a cult, or like different
Mm-hmm.
types of like constituencies within the cult? I don't know. It was
Yeah,
interesting to me.
I mean, I think that the unifying component of the invitation as an organization is is that it's offering a way out of grief. It's offering a sense of relief from the sorrow that we all feel when we encounter tremendous loss. And so I think in a way that was probably the nugget that drew me to the film in the first place, was this idea that we could all benefit from less pain in our life, right? I mean, who doesn't want less pain? And yet what I think the film is asking, um and so I think that everyone who joins the invitation has a very meaningful set of experiences that drive them toward wanting relief from pain and sorrow. And my hope is that that's actually pretty relatable, pretty sympathetic.
So there's a reference to Sadie being Manson-y or Mansonian, and
Mhm,
there's which is kind of a fun like dialogue riff that the actors have.
mhm.
And there's also a reference David makes to a home invasion in the hills, which I think kind of recalls the Manson murders. And I was just thinking, like, how much did you guys think about Manson, you and the screenwriters, and just in the production in general?
I think that Charles Manson and that terrible episode in California's history um, is definitely a touch point for the invitation. But I also think there were all kinds of organizations or cults or religions, however you want to identify them, that speak to this universal desire to escape the self and surrender the self to something bigger. And so, in the case of the references to Charles Manson and that and the Sharon Tate murders, um, really what that was very much about was a reference to California and to Los Angeles in particular as a place in which a lot of people gather here looking to start over, looking to remake their identity. Um, and it was very much a nod to a kind of culture in which a dinner party like this is frankly even possible, in which it's a little loosey goosey and a little bit boundary pushing and honestly just a little bit scary and uncomfortable. Um, I think we were all drawing on our own experiences. Phil Hay and Matt Manfredi, the screenwriters, and myself, we were all drawing on our own experiences of living in LA, particularly at the beginning, and some of the feelings we had that we were sometimes out of our depth in social situations that felt like they had codes or meanings that eluded us.
Yeah, very well put. And I think that's such a wonderful theme of the film. I mean, it's very specific to LA and to the milieu, but it is kind of universal, this idea of the pressures to conform and go along
Mm,
with something that you don't understand or that's perhaps dangerous or abusive.
mm.
And I was just wondering, how personally, like when to respond to that feeling. And
Mm,
there's that moment where Dave, or excuse me, where Will he seems very alarmist after the
mhm.
Choi
Yeah,
reappearance or appearance,
yeah,
and he's just
yeah,
stricken because he's realized that he was being alarmist and overreacting.
yeah,
And that's what we're all trying to avoid, I think, is coming across
yeah,
as paranoid and alarmist, but
yeah.
also reacting appropriately. And I love the questions that your film asks about that.
Mm, mm.
And have you moved closer to an answer to that question of like, how do you know when to, or it's a,
Yeah, it's a really interesting question about that you're asking about when is it appropriate to name the elephant in the room or to point out the utter strangeness potentially of a situation. And I think by and large, most of us look to protect other people by not pointing out some embarrassing or potentially damaging reality that everyone seems to see together. I think that there's a kind of interesting, compassionate desire to avoid other people's embarrassment, but or of course selfishly to avoid embarrassing ourselves. But in the end, I do think that calling something out for what it is a very powerful experience and also incredibly necessary for any kind of real change to occur. People have to walk out onto a ledge in which they might make a fool of themselves, right? Or seem alarmist or paranoid. And a big part of what drove us to make this movie was our love of a tradition of movies, particularly from the 60s and 70s, that seemed to suggest a world in which it was possible that you be both afraid and paranoid that people were out to get you and living in a world in which people were out to get you. And so that kind of dual and somewhat competing reality is what we're trying to explore with the movie.
yeah, it's so brilliant. And I low key, like Claire, I think is one of the great characters of the film.
Mhm.
And she's, I mean, I think in your opinion, does she get killed by Pruitt, or do you not want to say?
You know what's interesting is there was a version of the movie that answered that question, and I
Okay.
won't say how we answered it, but what we realized was that in the end, answering the question didn't actually advance the emotional relationship to the movie. And in fact, the question is what advances that
Yes,
relationship, keeping that alive. And so we did decide in the editing phase to pull that answer out of the film.
I love that so much.
Mm,
It's like the perfect amount of ambiguity. I will say
mm,
that you've talked about LA having this culture of kind of like conformity or perhaps like not wanting to be impolite. I would say that we
mm.
have that as well in the Midwest. I know that you're
Oh
from
yeah,
Missouri, so
yeah.
perhaps it's similar. I actually went to Mizzou for a year, so
Oh
I
wow.
knew a lot of people from St. Louis. But
Mm.
but yeah, we have this issue where people are like polite to a fault a lot of
Yeah,
the time, and but yeah, it's something that we have to navigate through. So
yeah. It's a little bit about gauging other people's boundaries, but really more than anything, getting in touch with and identifying your own boundaries, right? Like to what at what point can you just no longer be pushed to pretend that you're on board for a crazy reality? And that's, I think, some of the question that the film is asking, like, what would it take to wake up from kind of the slumber of politeness and courtesy.
And that's like the challenge that's running through the whole film because Will, he just is constantly uncertain, and that's kind of like where the red herrings, they're not just like genre devices, they're actually like the substance of like what what is reality and like how do you gauge
Yeah,
all these problems and like
yeah.
what do you think about the explosion of podcasts and docuseries about cults and like do you have an opinion about kind of how also how your film kind of fits within like the cultural obsession with cults? Like, do people
Uh-huh.
contact you to like talk about cult stuff and in that way? Or
I mean, I know that as people, I think we struggle to understand what happens when we lose our identity. What does it mean? What have we lost? How have we lost it? And I think for a lot of people, the obsession with cults is both a sense of an attempt to reassure ourselves that that's not who we are, as well as an attempt to understand perhaps how close any of us are to actually signing up for belief systems that harm us. And so, for me, as somebody who grew up in a largely agnostic household, yet grew up in Missouri, and saw the effects of what I would define as religious fanaticism, in my own life, in my family's life, in the culture at large, and then to see how that continues to affect regular people's lives every day. I think, in a way, our obsession with cults is ultimately our obsession with our own frailty as people, our own vulnerability as people. And it's a desire, I hope, to try and connect to other people's frailty and try to find a way out and try and find a way toward, I hope, a better understanding of how we could even get to this place.
absolutely. And the first time I saw the invitation, I was so struck by, and we kind of already talked about this, but just how much empathy you had
Mm,
for people who were seduced into this destructive belief system.
yeah.
Um, and I think that's such an important piece to keep in mind. Is
Well, and
to not
yeah,
condescend to them. You know.
totally. I mean, and you bring up a really good point, which is that we always saw the story as an examination of a failed marriage and of a love story that fell apart because it could not sustain the grief, that it had to endure within the relationship. And so, um, for us, it was so much about depicting people who loved each other very, very much once, and that the haunting quality is as much about feeling like you've lost that person, in the present, as it is to face the sorrow of your past. And so much of it was meant to feel, genuinely sad and genuinely, um, like a tragedy, really, and an examination of a tragedy, between two people.
Yeah, I think one of the most like impactful or salient quotes in the film is this conversation about whether pain is optional,
Mm,
and and she says it's it's optional, uh and that's they have it. Will has a different perspective, and his friends have a different perspective, and they're suffering like they all have kind of issues as well. Like you have
mm,
glimpses of each character at that party, like some of the things that they're going through. And I think
mm,
one sort of counterbalance to the pain of the characters is this idea of like friendship. And I was wondering
mm,
just how
mm,
much you were thinking about the friendships between the ensemble and like
mm.
that as a potential theme, like the fact that these people are in community and that they genuinely care for one another.
Oh, that's such a great point, because one of the things that we always hoped, Phil and Matt and our producers and myself, we always hoped would happen from the film, is that you'd watch this movie and you'd feel maybe kind of shaken by it, but that you would look to the person sitting on either side of you in the theater and say, well, I have that person and I have that person. Like, I have people next to me. And that there would be some sense that that's really all that matters is the person next to you. Like, what can you do to walk through the world with the people around you, next to you, in your heart? And so for me, the community component of the story is actually like the crucial underpinning of it, that we're watching a character in Will who has lost his community, who has, to some degree, banished his community, and has come back in to try to reconnect with that community. And in doing so, has to confront a complicated or disturbing reality within it. But that in the end, my hope is that we understand that all we have is each other. That's the only way through, this sometimes really difficult experience called life. Yeah, I mean, I think that the film was always meant to occupy a, a morally complex space, in which the the notion of what it means to be alive, how we inhabit that life, how much joy or suffering are we willing to tolerate, um, is a question that I hope the film keeps asking of the audience, um, because I think in some respects the film is saying it's not, living and dying aren't enemies of one another. It's part of what makes us human, but it's the taking away of agency. It's the taking away of choice that is problematic on a ethical or moral level. And so I hope that the film invites conversation about how much suffering is too much, um, and how much suffering is absolutely worth it because it makes the joy that we do experience that much more intense and valuable. I think that's kind of the question I hope that the film is trying to ask.
So you described the like this term serenity for sale in an interview, which I thought
Mm,
was such an interesting shorthand for,
mhm,
I don't know, like some people would call it woo woo culture.
mhm,
Do you
sure.
society has changed since 2015? I would argue. Do you
Mm,
believe that like things are becoming more pluralistic and tolerating different belief systems, and is that a good thing, or do you think it's like people are becoming more irrational and therefore more vulnerable to fraudsters and charlatans and
mm,
death cults, and like do you have like
mm.
a, I mean, that's also kind of a personal question too. I don't, you shouldn't feel like you need to like opine in a punditry kind of way, but I'm
Uh-huh.
just curious what you think about how society has changed since the invitation came out. And
Oh, I mean, I certainly think we have seen what the effects of relentless depictions of fantasy do to our minds, as a culture and as individuals, because in some way the noise, for instance, of internet culture and social media culture is just a very, very intricate expression of fantasy. And so um, a lot of times we're not really getting to the truth of something. We're just propagating an untruth or a delusion or a manufactured image of what we'd like people to believe about us. And so for me, it's really important to keep asking myself, to what degree do I want to interface with that culture, that noise, that fantasy when I'm trying to tap into the contours of my own creativity and my own thoughts and philosophy and feelings. And so for me, I'm aware that things have felt like they've been turned up several notches on the volume, but I also am hopeful that as we're seeing the detrimental effects of that, that maybe we can start to regulate ourselves better and treat some of the noise of culture right now the same way we would treat it as smoking cigarettes or injecting hard drugs or drunk driving. Like, it's just not a safe thing for us to do, and it's harming us. And that's kind of where I stand at this point on all of that.
That was brilliant, and I really appreciate you sharing your views on that.
Hmm.
Um, Thank you so much, Karyn.
I mean, I think that the notion of a single author is definitely problematic, because almost no art form is as collaboratively, um, well, almost no art form is as dependent on collaboration as filmmaking is. So, to me, I don't really subscribe to the idea that the director is the sole author of a film. Um, I often like to say that the director should be the last word, but in collaboration with all of the trusted partners that help mount a film. So I tend to be a little bit more flexible in my understanding of a director's role. I do think that women are held to a much higher level of scrutiny. Um, I think that the concept of failure and success is somehow more, particularly failure, more lacerating for women. It's held against them for longer. Um, Generally, I mean, I think it's worth investigating whether or not women have to pay a price for failure, um, for a longer period of time than their male counterparts. I think there is a desire, at least, um, a lip service being paid to more women directing horror. And I know that I have been um, introduced to or offered a lot of opportunities in horror that ultimately I haven't taken, because the films or the franchises or the stories don't quite appeal to me. I think it's possible that we'll see more and more women in horror. But again, all of those kinds of changes tend to take some time to really get implemented. It's funny. It's like it's a label to um, embrace in some respects because it is exactly who I am. I am a woman and I am a director, but I certainly don't look for the label to marginalize me any more than I've already been marginalized by simply existing in this business. So for me, it's just really important that I be, um, ideally thought of as a director with her own perspective on the world, her own set of creative goals, and so for me, that's what I'm always sort of trying to cultivate, is the idea that that I'm my own person, sort of. I don't want to say regardless of gender, because I don't think there's a world where we live regardless of gender, but I also feel like um, I want for women and men and everything in between to feel like they can participate in my work and feel spoken to because I'm human, you know?